I'm Tyler Suiters, and you're watching Clean Skies News. In a recent series of op-eds in the Washington Post, various authors weighed in on the chances for climate legislation to be taken up and eventually passed by Congress sometime this fall. One of them is joining me right now. Kenneth Green is a resident scholar with the American Enterprise Institute, also an environmental scientist. He served as an expert reviewer for the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Kenneth, good to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
The main topic today, your recent op-ed article in the Washington Post, one of several gauging the barometer for climate legislation coming up this fall in Congress. You have an interesting take, along with your co-author Stephen Hayward, also from AEI, saying that the failures or potential failures of healthcare reform could help advance a climate bill.
It could help advance a climate bill. It could also help retard a climate bill. Either way, it's going to have a ramification on what comes out in climate. Either the Congress will be too bruised to go for something really aggressive, or the president will have spent enough capital he doesn't want to spend more, or they'll have gone down in health care and feel they have to get something for his agenda, and they'll try to salvage it through a climate bill. However, whatever they have to do, hook or by crook, to get one.
A similar scenario in the Senate as what we saw in the House in terms of the factions breaking apart and who wants what as the negotiations get underway?
I think it's even worse in the Senate. The lines in the sand in the Senate are being pretty strongly drawn, and I don't really see the Senate wanting to go to Copenhagen with a signed deal. This is one of the things that neither I nor any of the other sort of pundit types I talk to understand. Henry Waxman wants to take a signed bill to Copenhagen. But that's all of your leverage and all of your bargaining power with the Chinese and the Indians. If you've already signed away the farm, why would they cooperate with you? So it doesn't really make much sense. And I suspect the Senate, where generally speaking more deliberative heads prevail, may want to slow this process down some.
Let's talk about the Waxman-Markey bill itself, Kenneth, since you brought it up, and the issue of allowance allocations. One industry that is pushing back fiercely against the bill is the oil and gas industry, because it seemed to be left out from the big chunk of those allocations that were handed out.
Oh, absolutely. They got the shaft in the first round of negotiations. If you look at it nationally, transportation fuels are about 33% of greenhouse gas emissions. They got around 2% of freely allocated permits, which means they're going to have to buy the vast majority of their permits right off the bat. Compared to the coal generation sector, the heavy industry sector, oil and gas didn't get a gimme. And there's only 15% left of this horse to trade away, although as my co-author Steve Hayward jokes, by the time this is done with the Senate, they'll have given away 150% of the allowable lots.
I think at one point Waxman-Markey was up to 104% in terms of the giveaways. Let's talk about that idea though, Kenneth. A 100% allocation seems to be the only wiggle room for appeasing another sector of the U.S. energy industry. Do we move to 100% to start off?
We really shouldn't. I mean, the fact of the matter is that President Obama had this right early on when he said that all of the permits had to be auctioned off for this scheme to work. Even the inventors of cap and trade, the guys who developed this idea economically, say this won't work for greenhouse gases unless you do it perfectly, unless it's, you auction everything off and you do it right. And so really we're already far outside the reservation in terms of what's going to work for the legislation with 85%. If you go to 100%, we're going to wind up in the same sort of shenanigans the European trading system saw, and very little will be accomplished.
Well, here you are at AEI, a conservative think tank, and one of the proposals that you support in your op-ed is from Senator Maria Cantwell, a Democrat who sits on the Senate Energy Committee, who has a teeny tiny bill that is getting very little attention, but seems to be a very simple, straightforward plan.
Yes, well, in fact, I'm trying to get Senator Cantwell to come to AEI and speak about it. And I wouldn't say that I necessarily support that bill. We don't pick and choose legislation to support or not. We analyze the strengths and weaknesses.
It's more viable in your eyes.
It's certainly more viable. We've written before that a revenue-neutral carbon tax is more viable than cap and trade. And certainly, if you're going to do cap and trade, Senator Cantwell's approach is much more viable. It auctions 100% of the permits off. It gives the vast majority of the revenue back to people to offset the economic harm of higher prices. It still diverts a bunch into a sort of a slushy fund for investments in alternate energy and that kind of thing. But still, compared to Waxman-Markey, 22 pages versus 1,500 pages of pork is a vastly superior alternative.
Well, is a carbon tax the way to go then, Kenneth? One of the phrases of praise you use for Cantwell's bill is, quoting now, "It's so crazy simple, it just might pass." And it seems that people are really pushing for simplicity.
Well, it actually is. It boils it down to purely cap and trade, which is one of the reasons why when I read it, I was very impressed. They resist all of the urges. In fact, they explicitly rule out the urges to tinker with redistribution of wealth through the rebates of the revenues. they avoid all of the temptations to tart the bill up with the favorite sort of liberal shibboleths that they want to put in these things that went up in Waxman Markey. So yeah, I mean, it could work, but on the other hand, they've so tarnished the very notion of cap and trade at this point. And the political atmosphere is so poisoned. It's hard to see the Republicans now saying, okay, that kind of cap and trade is okay, whereas this kind is not.
With AEI here in Washington, D.C., Kenneth Green is a resident scholar there, also a former expert reviewer with the UN's IPCC. Kenneth, thanks for sharing your insight today.
Thanks for having me on.
And the latest deadline, at least what we've heard from Harry Reid, for senators working on climate legislation is the end of September. I'm Tyler Suiters. You're watching Clean Skies News.